Canadians of Jamaican heritage will be celebrating their 50th anniversary of independence. So I wanted to make a connection to that event. And I have a good friend who's Jamaican. He's lived in England for the last 40 years, but he was born and raised in Jamaica. His name is James Barry. James is a world-renowned poet, but he's also a storyteller. He has collected Anansi stories and published them. And when James was about 17 years of age, he left Jamaica to seek his fortune in the United States. He went into the Deep South and became a farm laborer. And there he encountered prejudice, the likes of which he had never known in his entire life. One instance he continues to talk about. He's nearly 88 now. But he got on a bus to go to a dance one evening, one Saturday evening. And within 5 minutes of getting on that bus, the bus screeched to a halt. The driver pulled a gun, held it to his head, and made him get off the bus because he'd accidentally sat in the section reserved for whites. He left the United States very shortly after that, and then eventually emigrated to England. He's told me many stories of his childhood, and he's also told me about the stories that he remembers, and the stories that have deep meaning for him. So I'd like to tell you one of the stories that has a lot of meaning for him. Mrs. Hen was happy. After 3 weeks of sitting on her nest, 6 beautiful yellow chicks had risen up beneath her and all around her, and now, for the first time, she had them out in the big farmyard. And the chicks scattered ahead of her, and they peeped, and she clucked, she clucked proudly, she clucked protectively, she clucked contentedly. It would never have entered her mind at that moment that her present happiness would soon be turned into misery. Mr. Mongoose peered through a crack in the fence. He watched Mrs. Hen and her chicks. He weighed things up. He'd have to make sure that nobody was around. And then he hid himself, waiting for the moment to be right. Out in the farmyard, Mrs. Hen continued to mother her chicks. She guided them around, clucking, calling out to them, pointing out morsels of food for them to eat. Mr. Mongoose looked around. Nobody was watching. He stepped through the gate into the yard. He looked as if nothing could stop him. And then he made a reckless, headlong dash and charged straight into Mrs. Hen and her chicks. Feathers everywhere, panic, terror, screaming, squawking, chickens scattered. And then nippily, boldly, as he had come, Mr. Mongoose laughed, disappeared, vanished. Mrs. Hen was shocked, shattered, but she turned this way and that way, trying to round up her chicks. And even as she did, she knew that one of them was missing. And as she moved her chicks away from that spot of terror, she brought them under her feathers, and she started to call. She called and called to the chick that would not answer. And the sound of that call was the sad call of a distressed mother. And then unexpectedly, a voice said, "It's awful, isn't it? It's terrible." And Mrs. Hen looked up. And perched on a low-hanging branch was Mrs. Mourning Dove. And Mrs. Hen said, "Yes, it was awful. I'm shattered. I'm completely shattered. Thank you for saying something." And Mrs. Mourning Dove said, "I saw the whole thing, you know. I saw the whole thing." "You saw all of it?" "Yes, I saw the whole thing." "Well, what can be done about it?" "Nothing. There's nothing we can do." "But there must be." "No, there's nothing we can do. He killed my whole family. And I can tell you, you've got to watch yourself. He's claimed several of my friends. He's also attacked me and tried to turn me into a pile of feathers. Are you sure there's nothing we can do?" "There's nothing." "Well, if you hear of something, will you let me know?" "Yes, I will," said Mrs. following morning, Mrs. Hen led her chicks to a different part of the farmyard. She was extremely watchful of them, but she was also trying to help them find food. And for a moment, she let her attention be diverted. She caught a flash of her on the corner of her eye. She leapt into the air, her wings beating, ready to fight for her life. But by the time her claws reached the ground, Mr. Mongoose had attacked and gone, and taken with him another of her chicks. Quickly, she moved the chicks away from that area of terror. She pulled the chicks in around her. And that's what went on every day for the next 4 days. And on that awful last morning, when her last chick was taken, a kind of madness came over Mrs. Hen. Her hurt was more than the sadness and the pain she felt for her chicks. There was a strange and peculiar loneliness that she felt. And when that last chick had been claimed, it was as if sight, hearing, all senses had drained from her body. She didn't even know how to be herself. And she wandered about aimlessly. And she began to try and find her nest. And she found it. And she stared at the nest, as if staring at it would somehow bring back her lost chicks. And then she climbed into the nest and she tried to get comfortable, but there were no eggs under her. There were no chicks. She felt very peculiar. And so she climbed out of the nest and stumbled around a bit, and then she just stood there. And then a voice said, "Now, you're just like me." It was Mrs. Mourning Dove. And Mrs. Hen said, "Yes, I'm just like you. I have lost all of my family too. Are you sure there's nothing I can do?" "You could take Mr. Mongoose to court. You could charge him with assault